Okay. Good morning and welcome to the 31st meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Can I please remind everyone present to turn off any mobile phones or other electronic devices. The first item on our agenda today is to decide whether to take items 6 and 7 in private. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. Our second item of business this morning is to take evidence by video conference as part of an inquiry into proposals for an independent fiscal body from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. Therefore, it's my pleasure to welcome to the meeting it's Mr. Sebastian Barnes and Ms. Lisa von Trapp. Now, I understand that there will be no opening statement, and therefore we will go straight to questions. Now, as is the normal situation with Finance Committee meetings, I will usually ask a few opening questions and then I'll open out the session to colleagues round the table. I noticed in my introductory hellos to you earlier on that I spoke rather rapidly, and given the fact that you may struggle with our accents a wee bit, I'll try and speak as clearly as it's possible for someone with my West of Scotland, Glasgow background. So I will try to speak clearly for you. Very much we would like to welcome you to our committee, and I really appreciate you taking the time to actually give us the benefit of your experience in this important area for us. So, you have given us answers to a number of questions already in terms of your written submission, but I want to go over some of those for our own record and also to provide clarification for members. So the first thing I would like to touch on is just the principles, the OECD principles for an independent fiscal institution. And I realise that the OECD Working Party of Senior Budget Officials has put together a first set of draft principles, and I'm just wondering if either of you, or perhaps both, could touch on what you believe the core of these principles should be.
Sure. I mean, maybe, well, first let me reassure you that my best friend is from Glasgow, so I should be okay with your accent. So far, so good, anyway. But in terms of the principles, maybe I should start by just giving you a little bit of background about how we developed the principles. And they've been approved. They're no longer considered a draft, but we are taking them forward to become a council recommendation, which means they will be elevated later this year. The principles were developed initially in our Parliamentary Budget Officials and Independent Fiscal Institutions Network. So they really draw on the experience of independent fiscal institutions that are in existence today. Some of those that are much older, like the Netherlands and the Congressional Budget Office, and some which are, have maybe about 10 years of experience, like Korea, and then some of the newer ones that have been coming up. So they're really grounded in institutions' experiences. I think it's difficult when you look at the principles to say which is the most important. We think they're all important, but I guess a lot of them, if they're interconnected, and although they don't all appear under the heading of independence and nonpartisanship, I think many of the principles actually do seek to reinforce independence and nonpartisanship, and also transparency. So I would really highlight independence, nonpartisanship, and transparency as the most important. And I think in our submission, I looked at some of the principles and thought about it in terms of if I had sort of a composite indicator of the most important things to sort of reinforce those principles of independence and nonpartisanship and transparency, they would be things like the leadership appointments made on the basis of merit and technical competence, clearly defined term lengths for the leadership and preferably independent of the electoral cycle, clearly defined criteria and process for dismissal, and that the institution have control over the hiring process and firing process for its own staff, obviously within local labor laws. The other thing is the ability to set their own work program. Again, the ability to maybe produce analysis at their own initiative. A separate budget line and multi-annual funding commitments where that's possible We do have some examples of countries where that is possible, like Australia. A guarantee of access to information and legislation that may need to be reaffirmed through an MOU. And then that the institution themselves provide sort of full transparency on their work and operations.
Okay, and you take the view that it's highly desirable that such a body should be established on a statutory basis. Can you talk us through some of your reasoning for that?
We do, and we actually recommend that it's in the higher level legislation, in part because initially, if the body is going through some sort of growing pains or difficulties, it's more difficult to shut a body down if it's established on a statutory basis in higher level legislation. It also, I just think, gives weight to the body in the eyes of the public and in terms of the other institutions that it has to interact with.
If I could just offer a perspective. So I work for the OECD and I've been involved with this work, but I also sit on the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, so I kind of sit on both sides of this kind of discussion. And I think one thing, just from that practical experience I would draw, is in the principles, the important thing is the mandate. And here we're talking about the mandate being in legislation. But you could read that just as about the division of labour, so this is what the Council will do. But I think the mandate actually has huge significance in this context, both because it defines the way the Council works. If as an individual you sit on a council and your mandate is to assess the government's forecasts, you take that assessment business very seriously in a way that is a different task from, say, if you were just doing forecasting. And I think it's also extremely important in terms of the impact of the council with the public that it has this mandate. A thing that struck me in Ireland is as soon as we were set up, our first report, we were accepted as being an official body that was doing this job. This just wasn't the opinion of X on the fiscal position or the accounts. This was an official body. And that's very important, I think, in terms of the council playing its role, as opposed to having some other think tank which can easily be dismissed because it doesn't have an official mandate to do its job. So I think that's why legislation gives it that level of protection and importance.
And I think you've looked at the example of OBR and the Institute for Fiscal Studies in the UK. Obviously, I mean, the difference with OBR being given that mandate versus the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which still does very good work, is, you know, in the eyes of the public, they carry a greater weight. They've actually been mandated by the government to do the role that they're carrying out. So I think that's a good example of what Sebastian's saying.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that you've said is you've talked about is the importance of local ownership. You've said that to be effective and enduring, an IFI requires broad national ownership, commitment and consensus across the political spectrum. How would you go about securing that? I mean, obviously, you touched on issues such as, for example, transparency, but I'm just wondering if you can expand a wee bit more on how you believe we can ensure that we do get that broad spectrum of acceptance.
I think one example of how countries have achieved this is actually in a way through Parliament. I think it highlights the importance of the role of Parliament, which brings together the different party groups. And there are institutions like the Slovak Republic's Council for Budget Responsibility, which a member of the parliamentary group for each party signed off on the establishment of that organization. So there was a sort of a consensus, a broad political consensus that was explicit and that came through the Parliament. I think that's one way that we've seen that happen, at least in the initial days. In Canada was similar. They had a broad political consensus that came through the party groups in the Parliament as well. So it's not just seen as the government of the day setting it up, it's actually seen as something that all parties stand behind.
Accountability is obviously a key issue, and certainly in your submission you talk about whether or not it should be accountable, an IFI, to the executive or the Parliament or both, and you say that mechanisms should be put in place to encourage appropriate accountability to the legislature. But I wonder if again you can talk a wee bit more about the issue of accountability in terms of where you think it would sit between the Parliament itself and the executive or the government.
Again, I think this will really depend on the remit that you give the body. But in terms of the Parliament, and I know you've received submissions that have recommended that it be set under Parliament. I don't have a view necessarily on whether it should be under Parliament, under the Executive, or stand alone. But even if it's set up in the way like the OBR is, where it's maybe under the Executive, there are important ways that it can be useful to the Parliament. And I think some of the ways that other institutions have done this is, all their reports are published, so they're available and Parliament can use them. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe they need to actually have a process whereby they officially submit their reports to Parliament so that they're debated. Maybe they need to be answering parliamentary questions. We would assume that would happen. There's cases, I think Sweden was a country of interest to you. In Sweden, every year, although they are not sort of linked to the Parliament, every year the Finance Committee in Sweden holds a hearing where they use the Fiscal Council's report as sort of their main basis for analysis of the government's budget proposal. So those are some of the ways that the analysis is useful for Parliament. The other thing that we've looked at in terms of the different country examples is whether Parliament plays a role in the appointment or dismissal process. And that is the case for, I think, about a third of the countries that we looked at, and I think 3 that might be, some of them obviously are parliamentary budget offices, so that's normal, but I think in Ireland, the UK, and the Slovak Republic are 3 examples where Parliament has either the right to appoint. I think in the Slovak Republic they actually appoint or dismiss based on, I think it's a 2/3 majority, or in one case it may be a full majority. It's a little bit different for each council member in the case of the Slovak Republic. In Ireland, I think the council members cannot be dismissed without the approval of Parliament. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Sebastian. And in the UK, again, the Treasury Committee has the ability to confirm or appointments or confirm dismissals. So again, there's that extra protection through Parliament.
I think so. Just to confirm that that's correct. In the Irish case, the appointment is essentially by the minister, but dismissal, we have terms basically of 4 years, and dismissal it requires a vote in Parliament, which is would be a really major step. And I think that gives the council a lot of protection against interference from the government. There have been cases in Hungary and Canada and others where councils have really come under a lot of pressure from the executive, and I think knowing that you have that level of protection is both good for the council, but also it's good for its credibility, because people know that the council can say what's true and make tough calls if it needs to, and that they're not all going to be fired, or in our case the budget is also protected. I think sometimes accountability can be a very abstract term, but I find in the Irish experience, the interactions that we've had with the Parliamentary Finance Committee that we go to after every report have actually been extremely useful for the Council. I think it's helped guide the Council's work programme. It's made us think about things in a better way, I think, than we would have done otherwise. And so I think that accountability isn't just a kind of nicety in terms of the way the institutions work. I think it has a real bite, and I think my sense is that Parliament finds us very useful. They don't have the resource, in the Irish context at least, they don't really have the resources to do the kind of work that the Council is doing, so it's an extremely valuable input for them, and I think we have better access to information, for example, than they do, and we have a better ability to process it. So there's a very sound two-way relationship there, which is very helpful, I think, to both sides.
I think it would be natural for your committee to think about how this new institution could be useful to you and to your debates. And I mean, I think the Scottish Parliament is an interesting parliament in that you have an enhanced committee system compared to a lot of the other Westminster model parliaments. With your Finance Committee, you have a scrutiny unit that does provide some very good analysis. So you're already a bit ahead of some of the other parliaments that we might work with. And but this gives you an additional opportunity to have analysis that might be useful for you.
Yes, I mean, the OBR does speak to the Finance Committee. We do take evidence directly from them. One issue I think which is of real importance and something we haven't really touched on before in terms of our evidence, so I'm very interested in your views on it. It's the issue of external evaluation, and you say in your submission that IFI should develop a mechanism for external evaluation of the work to be conducted by local or international experts, and you go on to talk about the forms that can take. I'm just wondering if you can expand a wee bit on that, and you can tell us how common it is for IFIs to actually have external evaluation of their work.
In fact, it's a fairly new. Well, there's some of the older institutions like the Netherlands do have a regular external evaluation, both of the quality of their work and sort of the scientific reliability of the work, I guess you would say. That happens, I think, on a 4 or 5 year basis. I'd have to go back and double check the details on that. In their case, I think they do that via academics, external academics. And this is actually something we're talking about a lot in our network and working on in terms of trying to come up with a framework for external evaluation. Another way that institutions have sort of created a continuous, I guess, feedback loop for themselves in terms of external advisors, at least, is panels of advisors that you see for Congressional Budget Office or the Netherlands or a Slovak Republic. That is not sort of a typical evaluation process, but it does allow them to bring their work, or if there's something that's a bit difficult, to bring it for scrutiny from someone outside and to get comments and advice. I think in Canada they were very proactive about going out to either the business community or academic economists and asking them to give comment on work in progress. Also between institutions, I mean, I think when Canada was working on costings of, let me give a pretty specific example, but I think it was F-1 fighter planes. They didn't really have the information that they needed, and they tried to find a jurisdiction that might have worked on similar things, and they ended up going to the US and working with the Congressional Budget Office and also the GAO to get some of that information. So that's another way that, they took the work that they'd done and they sort of had it checked by a jurisdiction that had done similar work. In terms of peer review, I don't know that I have an example of a peer review of a full institution per se. I have examples where there's been peer review of work. I think where that idea partly comes from is how auditor generals have developed a system of peer review. And we think that's a good idea and something that the independent fiscal institutions in our network want to explore.
I mean, I think it's for the sort of new generation, of which Ireland is an example of fiscal councils, because we've just been set up, this problem hasn't really arisen yet, but we now realise that after 2 or 3 years it's going to be time to look at it. I think the logic of it is there's always this question of who watches the watchdogs, and this seems to be a solution to that. And I think it's important for the good functioning of the councils to make sure they're doing as good a job as possible, and also for credibility with the public to show that this isn't just a group of boffins who are meeting, there's really some proper evaluation. I think there's a feeling that at least some of the peer review is a promising channel, because what councils do is somewhat idiosyncratic, and so having a perspective from someone else facing the same problems is probably the most useful way to go. Rather than having, for example, academics who may have known about economics, but may not really face the practical challenges of a council, which are partly about economics, but partly about kind of institutional functioning and about how you fit into the wider system. So I think that's why we find peer review a fairly attractive option. And in Ireland, I think we're planning to do one in about 18 months' time, by which time the council has been going 2 or 3 years, to make sure that people think we're on the right track, both analytically and in terms of playing our role as a council and fulfilling our mandate.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to open out the session to colleagues around the table, and the first person to ask a question will be Jamie Hepburn, followed by Jean Urquhart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Thank you for your evidence thus far. In Annex 1 of your submission, you produce a breakdown of the roles of fiscal bodies in 17 member countries. And I thought it was rather interesting to note that only 2 of the bodies have a role in preparing official forecasts, the OBR and the Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis, and the other bodies seem to have rather wider roles. So I suppose the question is the OBR anachronistic? Should it be empowered on a wider basis? You might not feel you can comment on that particularly, but also how can this inform the process of establishing a body here in Scotland?
I mean, again, when we talk about this question of local ownership, you have to think about what is the problem that you're trying to solve. I think OBR, the idea behind OBR was trying to solve a specific problem around forecasting and credibility. That's maybe not the case for a lot of the other countries. The Netherlands is a much older institution that's developed over time. It's much bigger. It has 145 staff. It does a lot of costing work of policies, which is part of the reason it's so big. And it's developed that role of independent forecasting over time. Yes, I can't really comment in terms of whether it's anachronistic, but I would say that it's more usual for a council, at least in the examples that we have, to assess a government forecast. And I think that's partly because most governments don't really want to give up control over the forecast. In that sense, you could look at the OBR example as being very brave.
I think I would just add on the forecasting issue, because I think this is probably quite relevant to the case in Scotland. There's a kind of trade-off, I think, between one of the things the council can bring to a forecasting process is a kind of another pair of eyes and a different perspective from someone who actually has to put the numbers together. In Ireland, we've both been doing an assessment of the forecast, but now, since this year, we've been doing an endorsement of the forecast, which we view as being a higher standard, and we've basically started our own forecasting operation to be able to do that. So in some sense, we have kind of parallel forecasts there. So that there's some gain to be had in kind of independence, and it's a good thing in some ways to have a split between who's doing the forecasts and kind of who's assessing, who's endorsing them. But I think there is a real issue in smaller countries about the division of the resources that you have. So in this, there's a lot of fixed costs involved in forecasting. You have to set up databases. You have to look at all the indicators that come out. You have to just go through certain things. And so I think there is a question in a small country whether it's better to have one set of people doing that or whether it's better to split it between the two. And I think there's the balance to be struck there. That might be something that you want to bear in mind in terms of the allocation of resources. Of course, there's a separate question about even if you have one team, how that should be governed and where it should be done. But I think that resource question is very, very relevant to smaller economies.
Thank you for that. In your paper, you refer to the OECD network of parliamentary budget officials and independent fiscal institutions. This is not a body I had been previously aware of, I have to confess. But I'm just wondering if you could tell us, are all members of this body, are they bodies that interact with the state legislature or executive, or other examples of sub-state actors? Because clearly, at least in the short term, some of us hope otherwise, that any body established here might be a sub-state actor.
I think you'll be pleased to know that members of your scrutiny unit have been attending this network for a few years now. So we do invite, in special cases, and this is perhaps just because of my personal affection for Scotland, but we have invited Scotland for several years now, and will continue to do so. And if there was a new body set up in Scotland, we would of course invite them. I think that may be the only case of a regional parliament that's been represented so far in the network, but it's not unheard of.
That's interesting.
In terms of the actual membership
Carry on.
I didn't answer your full question. In terms of the actual membership, I mean, it's a fairly diverse group of people, in the sense that we have independent fiscal institutions, which are legislative budget offices. We have fiscal councils, and we have countries that don't have a legislative budget office or a fiscal council, where someone will come from the parliament who may work for the finance committee or who may work for a unit like the scrutiny unit in Scotland. So it's a quite diverse body, but dominated by independent fiscal institutions.
So it's actually quite a diverse range of types of bodies in there. Okay, that's helpful. You also talk about the type of information that any body might be established, and you suggest that the body might need a relationship with HMRC, Revenue Scotland and other relevant parts of the Scottish Government. And in terms of the powers of anybody, you say that access to information should be guaranteed in legislation. That's one of your OECD principles. Robert Choate, when he was here, it was pretty clear that it was vital that any independent fiscal body that is established by this Parliament or the Scottish Government has to have access to information from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. But the issue we have is that we don't have legislative competence over HMRC. Do you foresee any issues with that? And I don't know if you can talk from your experience of dealing with bodies across your membership, if there are any parallels or lessons we can learn.
I mean, I think that the issue of information is pretty vital, both because you need the information, but also, in what I've seen in Ireland, if you don't have a good right to it, the council spends an unbelievable amount of its time chasing information, which obviously reduces its ability to do other things. So I think it's very important. Though this is obviously an important principle, in practice it can be sometimes harder to know exactly what information you're kind of asking for, or even putting in the legislation as a kind of right. And so I think in practice, and I think this was actually discussed at the PBO, I mean, in practice a lot of these things are always going to depend on kind of goodwill and good relationships between the institutions, and maybe it can be a complicated thing to organise, but to have a memorandum of understanding between institutions about what they'll share. There can be a difficult specific problem that may apply in the case in which you're talking. Can be, I mean, there are real confidentiality issues around some of these things. For example, a lot of taxes are actually paid by very few people or companies or whatever, and so there are questions about protecting that information that are very difficult issues, and which I would say in the Irish context, not got into. But I think having a good sort of mixture of the ultimate legislative backstop that the council has a right to stuff, though in this case I appreciate it might be difficult, but then I think in practice understanding that it's really going to work on relationships and goodwill and maybe some sort of semi-formal institutions like a memorandum of understanding. I mean, often the problem is you sort of want to have a conversation with someone to figure out what they know or something like that. It's not the thing you can really put down in a request and say, I absolutely want this number. And so, I mean, the tax might be an issue like that where, I guess it would be good to have some, you would want to think about having some relationship where they were on board and willing to help you. You don't necessarily need to know every last number and stuff, but you need to be able to call them up and say, why is tax, where's the revenue gone in September? And someone to be able to give you in general terms an answer to that. And I would say, based on what I see in Ireland, we don't have a direct relationship with them at the moment, but we have a relationship with the people who do in the Department of Finance, and they've sort of, they've given us enough of an idea that the council needed about specific companies that were having a big impact at the aggregate level. We don't need to know the identities of them or exactly why they're doing what, but just have a sense in how it's going to impact the budget and how it's impacting the economy.
Maybe I would add, I think one of the interesting points for you is that maybe a lot of the data that we sort of expect to be available when we're dealing with the country might not be available for Scotland at the moment. And one of the things that you're going to have to think about if you set up a new body is what kind of data might be missing that they would need to do the kinds of forecasting that you're looking for.
Thank you. Other witnesses have raised that as an issue. I think that is something we need to consider. Mr Barnes has partly answered my follow-up question because he's talked about the Irish experience. I'm just wondering if there are other examples of the independent fiscal institutions that are members of your network that don't have a direct relationship with whatever the body may be in their country that has responsibility for taxation and accruing revenue for the National Exchequer.
No, I don't think so. I think they all do, maybe at different levels. I mean, in most cases, there is a right of access to information in the legislation. We do see cases sometimes where the legislation might be a bit open to interpretation, and sometimes governments or different agencies will use that to slow down the process of giving information. But no, I mean that's a standard thing that they would have that access to.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would point out that the Scottish Parliament is a national parliament within a multinational state, not a regional parliament. I made a mistake earlier on. Unfortunately, I said that Jean would be speaking next. That was actually John. My eyesight is deteriorating by the day, it seems. So the next person to speak will be the Deputy Convener, John Mason, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think I wanted just to really go back to the first point, and I think it was Ms von Trapp said at one stage, what problem are we trying to solve? And I suppose I am not sure if we have a problem and therefore if we need to solve it. I mean, is it correct that basically it's because governments generally have been over-optimistic in their forecasts that we need such a body to come in and give a bit of reality? And therefore, theoretically, if a government or a parliament was a bit more realistic, conservative, prudent, these kind of words, we would not actually need such a body.
Maybe I'll make one comment and then I'm going to turn that to Sebastian. But the argument we often have from New Zealand is that they are so transparent that they don't need this kind of a body. But that's open to debate, and I think Sebastian may be able to provide a better answer to your question.
I mean, if you look across OECD countries over a long period of time, public finances over the last 30, 40 years have really been on a very poor trend. So most countries had very little public debt in the early 1970s, and now 100% of GDP debt is not untypical for an OECD country. Now you can argue about whether 100% is an okay level or not, but it's clear that rise in debt wasn't a deliberate policy by anyone. It's a result of weak control of the public finances. There are some countries that are exceptions to that, but not many. And in parallel, countries have also been taking on, or many countries have been taking on massive pension liabilities that are essentially kept off the balance sheet. So I think it's against that background that I think the Fiscal Council's debate comes in. And it's a little bit like I often think about it a little bit like the monetary policy debate. I mean, monetary policy in the 70s, inflation in lots of places out of control, all sorts of problems. We then had a sort of big effort to make central banks independent, to clarify their mandates. And though the outcome is, has many imperfections that we're all unfortunately paying the price for today, in some ways, a lot of progress was made. And so I think there's and the reasons why the debt has sort of been, has risen in that way differs between countries, but there's a variety of problems. And so I think the problem you mentioned is a real one in many countries. In the UK, there was a perception that there was over-optimism, and that was a problem. There are many other countries around Europe where it's pretty clear it's an over-optimism bias as well. But I think that's not the only reason why you would want to create a fiscal council. One set of reasons, again, it probably doesn't apply in your case, but I mean, there are countries where the government just can't manage the public finances. It writes a budget at the beginning of the year, and then they spend some totally different amount at the end of the year, and things are just kind of out of control in that sense. And a fiscal council can be part of the way of controlling that. But I think there's a much broader case than that for a council. I mean, if you take the case of Ireland, which I'm quite familiar with, I mean, in Ireland, in some ways Ireland ran things pretty prudently. It was about the only country in Europe that consistently ran a budget surplus during the early 2000s. So they sort of seemed to be doing prudent things, but in truth they didn't really manage the risks carefully enough. Now, there's probably things in the banking sector that fiscal council wouldn't have been able to do much about, but it's pretty clear as well on the fiscal side that they were taking risks they shouldn't have done. There was a lack of analysis of some really important issues, which meant, and the only way they found out how big the impact of the crisis would be for the crisis to actually happen. So I think the public finance in Ireland over that period could have been better managed, and the council could have contributed to that, both by its analysis, but also its recommendations to the government and helping to explain to people what the risks were. That things seemed to be going fine, but there were big vulnerabilities underneath.
I mean, that was very helpful. Thanks very much for that. Because, I mean, then if we continue with the Irish example, then if the Fiscal Council had been in place, and even though the political parties in the government seem to be being quite prudent and running a surplus, they might have pointed out that really it should have been a much higher surplus and therefore savings or whatever for the future. I mean, presumably that is just to give that forecast or that comment, whereas all the political parties in Ireland might just have decided, well, that's going overboard and we'll just ignore that. But still the information would be there. Is that kind of your argument?
Yeah, I think the argument is that the Council hopefully would have made that analysis, would have made that point. Of course, people might have dismissed it, but if the Council's effective, if its analysis is convincing and it has this mandate from the government to do it, it might have been hard to listen to. And one point, I mean, the point the Department of Finance in Ireland would make, rightly or wrongly, is that they were making these warnings to ministers and they were ignored. But they were making them essentially in private, and that dynamic played out. Maybe by making it in public with a body that has an explicit mandate to do so, has much deeper analytical resources focused on this, who knows what would have happened. But I think the hope would have been that those mechanisms of the mandate, the independence, the credibility, the analysis, would have helped to ensure, made it more difficult for politicians to ignore those kinds of arguments.
Okay, thank you. I mean, Scotland with the position, and we're debating whether we're a region or a state or a nation or whatever we are, but if we say sub-state at the moment, I mean, we have got fairly limited powers at the moment. We're getting some more powers soon over a bit of the income tax and one or two other taxes. I mean, do you have an opinion, is this the right time for us to be setting up such a body, or should we wait until we've got more powers? Because in reality, we do not have a huge amount of flexibility. We cannot get hugely into debt and problems like that.
I think under our principle of local ownership, I think that's for you to decide. Yeah, I think it's a difficult balance, and you're in an unusual situation. I mean, the logic that Lisa set out and you set out is, what problem are you trying to fix? And in some sense, if you have a system that's running already, it's more obvious to see what the problems are. In the Scottish case, you're obviously starting from, you're taking new powers, a new position. So in a sense, it's less clear what the exactly how you should play that, and I'm not sure I would have particularly strong views about that. I think one thing that the Council might be able to bring you is, and again, this is from the lesson of small countries, is that small countries can be very volatile. The economy is typically dependent on far fewer activities than even a country the size of the UK. And so I think risks, for example, are extremely important in that context. Now, fiscal councils won't necessarily tell you what to do in the light of those risks, but I think they can help to build a framework and to go through the arguments and to protect yourself against the kind of thing that's happened in Ireland. So that might be one of the things you might want to consider. And I'm not sure how that plays through in your actual and prospective institutional framework, but I think that's something that the councils can bring.
I mean, it was mentioned earlier on that maybe actually at a Scottish context we don't have the information available, or at least publicly available, to fully analyse the Scottish economy and to make full forecasts. I mean, do you think a fiscal body like this, would that actually be a boost to producing information because they would be demanding it?
Yes, I think that's true, and I think that's one of the things the councils, even with respect to parliamentarians who have many other important activities, the councils really just focused on that. And so I think in Ireland there's a lot of information that we've called forward that wouldn't otherwise have been in the public domain, but I think also just wasn't available even to people within the Department of Finance. So I think it is a powerful role to have someone kind of full-time thinking about these things all the time. Obviously information is costly to collect, but I think in general we tend not to have enough of it, take decisions a little bit in the dark. So I think councils can be very helpful, both in getting that information collected and existing, but also in disseminating it and interpreting it for people.
That's great, thanks so much.
Thank you, John. Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Gavin Brown.
You gave a pretty strong statement there about the need for independent financial institutions, particularly around controlling public debt and managing risks. But I mean, in your paper, you do say they're not a panacea, and then you say alternative institutional arrangements may serve some countries equally well, which perhaps is slightly more open-minded than what you said in your last set of answers. I wonder whether you did have particular countries in mind when you made that statement about alternative arrangements may serve some countries equally well, or was it rather a theoretical statement?
I would just say from the part of the OECD that I work in, I mean, it's a pretty standard, we make recommendations to individual countries about a number of things, and these are peer-reviewed basically by the OECD members. And having a fiscal council or independent fiscal institution of some sort would be a pretty standard recommendation. in almost all of the work that we do. There may be exceptions to that. Perhaps Lisa knows what they are, but I think, I would use an exceptional clause rather than being
more of an exceptional clause. But I think what we were also trying to point to was the concerns of maybe some of our member countries where they don't have one institution that fulfills all of the roles that we might think of as a fiscal council, but they may have several institutions that each maybe take a piece of that role. And I'm thinking specifically of Germany, which has quite a few independent institutions doing different pieces of work that, if you put them all together, probably would be a very strong fiscal council. So I think that was more in reference to that.
Okay, thanks very much. You said the OBR, I think you used the word brave, which was putting a slightly different slant on Jamie Hepburn's suggestion there. And in your paper, you say IFIs face real risks when they produce critical analysis, particularly in their early years. Again, I wonder if you've got any examples there, or again, is that just a general statement?
No, I mean, there's different kinds of risks that we've seen councils facing initially. One is that they're ignored. It's not so... doesn't sound as dramatic, but it actually is quite dramatic if you are a new council and you're trying to establish yourself and your credibility to be ignored, particularly by government. Perhaps the best example, and I don't know if you've looked at this, is the example of Hungary, where in fact, and this is partly just due to the political system, they had the government disliked, although they were set up with sort of a full support across the political spectrum, once they began to produce critical analysis, the reaction of the government was very strong, and the government had such a large majority in Parliament that they were then able to cut their budget to, I think it was 50,000 euros, and dismiss all of their staff. So, I mean, that's the most extreme case we have where they were able to sort of basically shut down the institution. But there's other cases. I mean, Sweden underwent a period where their budget was under threat. Canada, their budget was under threat. And this sort of played out in a very difficult way in the press between the council and government representatives. And so there's real risks in terms of threats to the budget, particularly. And
I mean, I suppose one area where they might well, where governments might fall out with them would be if they had a remit to explore alternative fiscal policies. How common is that in such institutions throughout the world?
Could you maybe clarify if you mean sort of...
Well, I mean, alternative policy prescriptions and working out what the consequences of following alternative economic policies might be. Is that a role that any of the institutions take on board?
It is a role that some of the institutions take on board. I mean, normally from a positive analysis, and this is what my question was going to be, why I hesitated for a minute. I think what some do, like the Congressional Budget Office, would sometimes be to look at options. So not necessarily say these are our government's policies and we think you should do something else, but rather to just say here are a list of options, and these are what we think the effects of those options would be. It's not that they're trying to give sort of a normative analysis or to say to government we think you should be doing this differently, but they are trying, and particularly because they are set up to serve the legislature, they are trying to show the legislature the range of options and the potential consequences. So I think that's one of the ways that that's done.
That would certainly seem to me to be a very useful function of such a body, and perhaps that would be more likely to happen if it was directly accountable to the Parliament rather than the government.
I mean, you also get the case where the well-known case of the Netherlands, but it's also been discussed in the UK context of looking at alternative policies proposed by political parties at election times. So that's election costing. That's a different exercise in a way, but in some ways fits into that. In Ireland, we're in an unusual situation since we have part of our mandate is very open, and we have to just make an assessment of the fiscal stance, which is a very open kind of thing. And in that context, we've shown alternative scenarios to the one the government's pursuing. which we've constructed. And again, it's for information, really. It's for people to understand it. Various people, people have different views about things. If you took a different view, this is what it would look like. And I think that's a useful function for councils to pursue as well.
I guess in our principle, sorry, the point that we do try to make, though, is we highly recommend that councils don't give normative policy advice, that they're not sort of drawn into the political debates in that way.
Since you've raised that example, and since it's a live issue in the UK, I mean, how common is it for opposition parties to be able to have their policies analysed and costed by one of these bodies?
For most of the institutions that are under the legislature, for the parliamentary budget offices, it's very common. There are institutions like the Congressional Budget Office where they are required to cost every piece of legislation. Of course, that involves a lot of resources. It's fairly unusual. There's institutions like the Netherlands who do something similar. In terms of costing election platforms, only Australia and the Netherlands do that at the moment. I don't think most political parties actually, have been under their platforms. I think it's an interesting idea and one that many people find very useful. I think there would probably be a period of adjustment as political parties have to start to think about actually the cost of platforms, because I don't think most parties actually do that in a very significant way. In the Netherlands, it's an interesting process to see. There are countries where they will cost pieces of legislation, but they have maybe a materiality or contribution potential limit. I'm thinking about Canada in this case, where they're a small body, so they're 15 staff. They can't cost every piece of legislation that the Parliament may want them to. So what they do is they sort of set a standard of, okay, is this likely to have a big impact on Canada's public finances, in which case they will probably take that on. The Slovak Republic, I think they also, at the request of Parliament, may look at costings of specific pieces of legislation as well, but they won't look at everything.
Okay, thanks very much.
Gavin Brown.
Thank you. Good morning. You've given us a paper with Annex 1, which has a list of OECD countries that have independent fiscal institutions. And I've just kind of noticed that about 50%, there are 17 countries down there, about 50% of them had an independent fiscal institution prior to the banking collapse and recession in 2008, and about 50% of them have been established since then. I just wonder, did countries that had independent fiscal institutions before the collapse have slightly better recessions than those that did not? I mean, I know that's a very general question, but is there any link at all or anything we can show that having an institution actually cushioned the downturn slightly?
So there's it's a very good question, and I mean, in some ways it's always difficult to assess, because the countries that had those institutions may be different from countries in other ways. So, for example, Sweden's a good example of an economy that appears to be pretty well managed, and that's because they had a nasty crisis in the 90s and they took the lessons from that. And that has a number of respects. It shows up in the way they regulated their banks, it shows up in various aspects of the way their system works, and it shows up in the fact they created a fiscal council. So they had a relatively good outcome, but they'd probably decided that they were going to be good people on many levels and took a lot of good decisions. I mean, Australia, though it's only been created more recently, actually has quite a strong tradition in this area. That the office itself is new. And again, you can tell a similar story. That they've had a relatively good crisis, partly through good luck, no doubt, but also because they've done a number of things, of which good fiscal management is one of them. So I think it is just, it's hard to answer that question, given there is this coincidence in a sense between good institutions and good councils and good outcomes, but across a range of things. If you look at, in fairness, if you look at some of those countries, even the Netherlands, which is always cited as an example, is an interesting one. And at times things in the Netherlands have been quite well run over the last 40, 50 years. Other times they've been badly run, and the CPB has always been there throughout. So it partly depends on the times and the culture and a number of other things. But I think we think there are good reasons to hope that it would. That these councils would help in that kind of situation. As I said, I think the evidence is hard to evaluate neutrally, and you can see good examples and bad examples within the history. But I think if you look at a country like Sweden or Australia or Canada today, that's kind of the way you should be running your country, probably in some level in terms of its institutions, and they all have councils. So maybe that's the way.
Thank you. In terms of another question then, a more specific one. Principle 2.3 of the OECD principles talks about term lengths and number of terms for the leadership roles within that body. I just wonder if you're able to expand on that. Do you have views on what sort of term length would be appropriate or is optimal? And also the same question about the number of terms. Are there trends or are there things that you think are optimal?
Yeah, I think in a lot of the countries there are term lengths that are close to the election cycle or a bit longer, or maybe they have staggered so that they're not running along the election cycle. I mean, part of that is to sort of again enhance the independence. We recommend that it not be linked to the election cycle, so maybe slightly longer, and maybe renewable, maybe not continuously renewable, but maybe renewable once. It's hard to say. I mean, countries do sort of have different ideas on this, but again, I think delinking it from the electoral cycle is one thing that's important, and also just being clear in terms of what the term length is. I'd say that the one country where this might be an issue is actually Korea, where there isn't a specific term length, but in practice, the head of the National Assembly Budget Office resigns every time there's a new speaker, which means that they resign every 2 years. They're not forced to resign, but they just do this in practice, and it kind of creates this odd situation where they may be seen as being too linked to the speaker, and then that sort of politicizes a bit the role. So
I would add, I mean, in Ireland we have staggered, which I think is a good idea, 4-year terms which are renewable once, which I think in that kind of context is fairly sensible. I think one of the issues is actually, I think, finding people to sit on the council is quite difficult. If they're part-time, it's hard to find people who can combine it with whatever else they do. And there aren't a huge number of people around with the kind of experience in public finance, in economics, and sort of, and kind of interacting in these kinds of processes. So I think you don't want to make it too short, or at least, you only make it really, you don't want the effective terms to be too short, because otherwise you're just going to be struggling to find people all the time. And in some ways the institutional memory is quite valuable as well, particularly in a small institution. If you have hundreds of staff, the CEO can change fairly quickly, but if the council's really a big part of the intellectual capital of the institution, you need some kind of continuity, I think, and the council is important in giving that.
Okay, thank you. And final question. You mentioned Principle 3.1, which says that the mandate of the institution should be clearly defined in higher level legislation. I just wondered, does pretty much everything to do with the body have to be defined in higher level legislation in your view, or can some of it be left to secondary legislation? I just wonder what your views on the balance of how much it really needs to be in primary legislation as opposed to regulation or follow-up.
I guess my own view on this would be that the kind of stuff that's in the principles needs to be in the higher level legislation to get to offer the protection to the council, which is really what you want. I guess my general view on these issues is you don't want stuff to be too prescriptive beyond what's necessary to achieve these objectives, because otherwise if you get it wrong at the beginning, the whole idea of this is to set a high threshold, so if you're starting to put really detailed things in that then you regret or things change, I don't think it should be in there. So I think something that's relatively clean on this, and I think within that then the council essentially should define how it kind of operates on a more detailed basis and be very transparent about that. In the Irish case we also have an MOU which covers a Memorandum of Understanding which also covers some of the specific issues around forecasting. We've used that MOU once, and we're about to revise it, which is, you know, a good case for having that in an MOU rather than in legislation, because otherwise we'd be basically stuck.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael McMahon.
Much, Convener. You've already touched on this in response to my colleague Malcolm Chisholm's questions about the role of an IFI in terms of recommending what should be done in terms of fiscal policy. Now, we've taken evidence at this committee on that and explored some of the pros and cons of any IFI taking on that normative role in recommending the course that any government should actually take. And one of the main reasons against it that's been cited is that it would politicise the IFI. Is that the main reason why you wouldn't recommend that they take on such a normative role, or are there other reasons why you wouldn't recommend that role being taken forward by an IFI?
I think it's partly about the division of labour. I mean, it's essentially your job to decide what should be done. I think the Council's real strength is really making a positive analysis in terms of, maybe, as was discussed earlier, what different options are, or a forecast that's the best view, sort of tries to present the best view and the risks in terms of what's going to happen going forward. But I think there is a question about the right division of labour in a democratic system, and I think there's a risk. It's a politicisation, and it's one of the things that's very important for councils is their credibility and a degree of buy-in. And so if the council appears to be somehow backing one side or the other, I think it can lose those things which are very precious, and I think that's where the hesitation would come from. I think something might be useful. I mean, in Ireland we actually go a little bit further in that we have to make this assessment of the fiscal stance, which is not explicitly asking for a normative view, but is a bit closer to that. And the framework we use there, and this might be just useful for you to know, is the way we frame a lot of those decisions is we have a sort of notion that there's a range of policies that's appropriate, and the Council's role is to warn if, within that context, if policies are inappropriate. So it may be that the deficit targeted this year should be this number or this number, and the Council is fine with that. There are legitimate views. There are reasonable people can reasonably disagree about that. Just if the policies seem to be really crazily counterproductive, I think the Council would then have a normative role to say, well, this policy is, in our view, not appropriate. You can pursue it if you wish, but we don't view that as appropriate. Within that, we have stated some preferences about. We've stated that we think what the government is doing is fine, but we have said that there is a strong case, which I think is true, on some specific things to do things a bit differently. But we've always been much more muted in the way we've said that, because we're less comfortable with that kind of role. We always have this framework of basically recognising that there are lots of views that are appropriate, and our real role is just to warn if the car's going off the road.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks very much.
I think maybe I would add that I think for a lot of the councils this is a very difficult thing, because even when they only do positive analysis, sometimes they find that they're walking a bit of a fine line. Just by pointing out the impact on the public finances of something, you can sort of show that it may not be a good idea. You don't have to say this isn't a good idea. You can, just with the numbers, probably show that, okay, we're going into risky territory here. So there is this kind of fine line that most of the institutions walk, whether or not they give normative advice, and again, almost none of them do.
Thanks very much. That certainly adds to the evidence that we've already taken on this, so thanks very much for that.
Thank you, Michael. That's exhausted questions from committee members. I'm just wondering if Ms Von Trapp and Mr Barnes have any further points they wish to make to committee?
No, I just wanted to offer, I mean, we have sort of done case studies on these different countries that are not necessarily publicly all available at this point, and if there was a country that you'd be interested in reading about in more depth, I would be happy to share that with the committee. And one country I was thinking that might be interesting to you, just in terms of functions, not so much necessarily in the setup, which is under the central bank, is the Slovak Republic, as another example to looking at Sweden and Ireland, which was quite influenced by Sweden.
That would be very helpful. Thank you very much. I'd like to call this session to a conclusion now, and I'd like to thank very much Lisa Von Trapp and Sebastian Barnes for answering our questions this morning. Thank you. I'd also like to end the video conferencing now and have a 5-minute break so that we can reorganise for our next session. can get started once again. So our next item of business is to continue to take evidence as part of an inquiry into the proposals for an independent fiscal body. I therefore like to welcome to the meeting someone who's no stranger to the committee, Professor David Bell, and also his colleagues Dr Angus Armstrong, Dr Katerina Lisenkova and Professor Peter McGregor. So welcome to you all this morning. And I'd like to invite Professor Bell to make an opening statement on behalf of the panel.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Just to start off by saying that the group of people here are all actually supported in one way or another at the moment by the Economic and Social Research Council UK and Scotland programme, and they're carrying out a number of projects that are specifically focused on the Scottish economy. And these projects will themselves add significantly to the technical capability to analyse the Scottish economy, irrespective of what happens in the referendum. So there are four types of model represented here. I work with my colleagues David Comerford and David Iser on a microsimulation model. Then Peter McGregor works on a computable general equilibrium model. Angus and Katerina work on a macroeconometric model, which is the closest thing to the kind of model that the OBR might use or the Treasury might use to forecast the UK as a whole. And Katerina also works on an overlapping generations model, which is more of a long-run takes more of a long-run perspective of the Scottish economy. So I won't go into the technical details of this at the moment, but we'll be happy to answer questions about them should these arise. So our argument is that these models could provide different perspectives on the Scottish economy going forward of the kind that a future Scottish fiscal body might be interested in. Now, I guess the first issue that the Parliament knows that it has to address is the issue around the taxes associated with the Scotland Act 2012, and the Office of Budget Responsibility is providing forecasts for these, and there is a question to what extent it is necessary to provide alternatives to the Office of Budget Responsibility's forecast, and I think that's something that we might explore in discussion. One of the key factors, it seems to me, that the Parliament will want to have a view around is the size of the block grant adjustment and how that relates to the way that the Scottish rate of income tax is operating. And our microsimulation model does look in detail at how income tax is raised across the spectrum of households in Scottish society. So there are a variety of reasons that one might question the accuracy of the Office of Budget Responsibility forecasts, and I think that's something that we might well want to explore in discussions, and I think Dr. Armstrong, who had a role in the establishment of the OBR, might be able to help the committee with specifically. Some of the other issues about the way that the body is set up, I overheard discussion of with your contributors from the OECD earlier on, and I don't want to go into those specifically at the moment, but clearly that's something that we'd be happy to discuss. One of the issues that does seem to me to be important is to whom the independent fiscal body, once it comes into existence, should be responsible to. And my view is that it should be responsible to Parliament and that its first point of contact should be the Finance Committee. Even within the existing budgetary setup, it seems to me that there are useful things which independent fiscal body could do, irrespective of forecasts for the Scottish economy as a whole, but things like the environmental impact statement, the equality statement, and say the distributional impact of the budget are all kinds of things which, well, to some extent they're done by the Scottish Government, but they are very much below the radar in relation to the kinds of headlines that the budget will get. But close examination of these kinds of issues, it seems to me, could garner greater interest in them if they're carried out by an external body. So I'll end my remarks there, and now happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Basically, as you'll know, David, how the committee works is I'll start off by asking some introductory questions and then open the session out to colleagues around the table. When I ask a question, it won't be necessarily specifically to an individual. The panel each of you can answer, or one of you can answer, or whatever. So it's whoever feels they want to make a contribution, please do so. I noticed, incidentally, in the third paragraph of your submission, David, that you say the forecasting record of the economics profession in general is not good. And you go on to say that we need to guard against seeing a forecasting body as a panacea for the uncertainties surrounding public finances. I mean, how do you kind of guard against that? Because I think the issue is that sometimes, and we talked about this last week to an extent with some of Jim Cuthbert's evidence about the issue of feedback loops, that, if such an organisation is established, it can be put on a pedestal such that the forecast itself can then feed back into the markets. What's your kind of view of that, and where that balance should be struck? And again, as I said, colleagues can contribute to that.
Yeah, well, I think, as we call them, point forecasts are potential things to ruin the reputation of any forecasting body. If you hang your reputation on some specific number, not realizing that there are a variety of probabilities associated with different outcomes, and you've seen maybe that kind of thing reflected in the famous Bank of England fan diagrams, which say, well, broadly our indication is that there's a 20% chance of a growth rate of 1.6% and so on. What is really damaging for the reputation of forecasting bodies is when the actual outcome goes outside the limits of the fan chart, which is what happened in the catastrophic events of 2008. So, I mean, if an economy is going along, sticking with trend, not being vastly over the kind of natural rate of output, or vastly below that rate, then the forecaster's job is quite easy. It's when there are big turning points that they come under pressure, and forecasters have not been terribly good at predicting major turning points, and very few people foresaw what was happening in 2008. And I guess the part of we've learned from that experience, but then will the next experience be quite different again, and therefore another need to change the kinds of ways that we do our forecasting. So one has to have healthy skepticism about forecasts, and one, I would think, with a body like this, have to protect one's reputation by not hanging too much on specific numbers, it seems to me. Does anybody want to add at all to that?
Yes, if I may. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The forecasting, because of the headlines and what you suggested, Mr. Chairman, about the attention that it can have in terms of markets and so on. I think that's one of the more misunderstood roles of a fiscal council. To assume that a small group of people have any more knowledge about a headline figure like GDP than the market collectively does, I think is putting a weight on these people probably greater than deserves to be, and stretching, their bounds of knowledge. The real public good side of the forecast is the detail. So nobody else, no financial institution, very few other bodies provide the taxation breakdown that the OBR does in its forecast, which allows people to do all of the estimates and see the degree to which the economic forecasts feed into the fiscal rules and whether they look like they're going to be achieved. But it's the detail, not the GDP number per se, which is, I think, the most important part. And then inside the forecast, it's actually what we call, rather unfortunately, unobservables, things like what is the trend level of output. This is absolutely crucial for determining whether you're hitting your fiscal rules. And because it's unobservable, reasonable people can disagree. And that's where the real value added in the forecast is, not the headline GDP numbers. And in fact, in my view, the OBR, in its early days, partly because it was such a difficult forecasting period, if you have a forecast which is away from the consensus, by human nature, it can just take a little time to get back to where the consensus is. And so it's almost a disadvantage of being away from the consensus. And I think the OBR now, their headline forecasts are very consensual. And I think that's probably quite deliberate, that they don't presume they've got that sort of knowledge, nor is it really the public good side of what they're actually delivering.
I mean, I think there's a real issue, of course, if a government or indeed an opposition, if they see a specific forecast, and I think a couple of weeks ago we saw the IFS forecast and the kind of level of publicity it got in terms of looking at Scotland's projected performance up to 50 years into the future, that these can be taken almost as gospel, actually, by commentators in the media, and also, obviously, for politicians to reinforce a specific view or not, and I think that's a real danger, is it not? How do we actually get that balance right? Because we have to have an independent fiscal body that's credible, that people respect its opinion, but don't put all kind of the weight on it that we've perhaps seen in the recent past.
One of the things I think is to distinguish between forecasts and projections. I think that's pretty important, because although I think the IFS report was widely misunderstood, it was actually a projection. So it's based on things really not changing in policy terms. And you had that discussion around with the OECD people about whether the fiscal body should be attempting to influence, influencing policy directly. I think the IFS what was trying to do was to say, under our best assumptions, this is what might happen if there is no policy intervention. And that's quite different from saying, in a couple of years' time, we're going to have a growth rate of 1.8%. So, I mean, it's a bit like these different models. They address different kinds of issues, and it is quite difficult to get that sort of message across to those interested, and certainly it's very difficult to get that message across to the general public, it seems to me.
I think, if I may add, I think it's rather, it is the responsibility of this body, I would suggest, also to be careful to conduct appropriate sensitivity analysis around any central projections to reflect alternative possible scenarios in the future. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies did that. Whether they did enough of that is an open question, I think, could be discussed. But I think you can handle uncertainty in a variety of ways with these approaches, and I think it would be incumbent upon the body to reflect that in one way or another.
Okay, now, again, David, in your own submission, you talk about what a forecasting body would add, and you talk about the OBR may choose not to produce forecasts specific for Scotland, and so differences between the Scottish and UK economies may not be fully captured. So I'm just wondering if you can expand on that a wee bit, actually, and see how such a body would assist. And can I ask, do each of the panel members, each of the witnesses, actually believe that we should establish such a body?
Okay, so the Office of Budget Responsibility, I think, takes the opinion at the moment that construction of a kind of full-scale Scottish model is not feasible, given the data availability. Now, the Scottish Government has had underway for some time a project called SNAP, the Scottish National Accounts Project, and that is building up quite an extensive kind of time series database of aggregates like consumption, investment, savings, and so on, in as good a way as possible, given the data constraints that they are confronted with. So, one approach that is being taken by the National Institute, which has a large number of macroeconomic models around the world. You'll hear, and Angus Katerina can speak about this much better than me, but they have lots of models for different countries, including the UK. A UK forecast is produced each quarter, and with funding from the ESRC, using the data available from SNAP, the National Institute is going to produce the best, I think, the best kind of model, or macroeconomic model, that it will be feasible to produce in the next few months, hopefully. And that would certainly offer quite a different perspective, potentially, basically because of the different methodology. Don't know whether it will produce different numbers, but a different methodology to the Office of Budget Responsibility approach, which is, I think, not that sophisticated in relation to the forecast produced for tax revenues in Scotland.
Okay, Professor McGregor.
Well, on the issue of whether we should establish a body, I think the answer to that, I think, is probably yes, regardless of the degree of fiscal autonomy, but perhaps the nature of and the scale of investment ought to vary with the degree of fiscal autonomy. And so clearly, if you are going all the way to independence, I think then it would be an absolute requirement with the degree of fiscal autonomy that is currently enjoyed by the government under the Scotland Act. I think there still is a requirement there in terms of the tax revenues and modelling around that. I would also say that, as David picked up earlier, that some of the wider functions that such a body might play could be extremely useful. So around issues of inequality and of integrating environmental impacts of policies with the economic modelling. I mean, it is possible under some modelling approaches to integrate, for example, energy demands, sectoral demands for energy, because they vary. Emissions, for example, vary dramatically across industries, and so if you're going to look at that, you need some kind of multi-sectoral modelling approach to capture it, because emissions vary with the composition of output as well as its total, and there's quite a lot of value added, I believe, that could be introduced by such an approach. So, but I think the scale of the investment may well depend on the degree of fiscal autonomy.
Okay, Dr. Lisenkova.
So first, answering your first question about whether it should be established, the independent fiscal body should be established in Scotland or not, I would say that on the balance, I would say yes, but then the question is, of course, of the cost and the benefits of this decision. So you're going to gain a certain type of information that's currently not available, and the level of details that OBR is not able to provide. But at the same time, it's your difficult decision of how much is going to cost the taxpayer to get this this level of disaggregation. And another point that David just mentioned about us building this model for Scotland, well, not just our model, but we represent a wide range of different models that have been built for Scotland. So it clearly shows that the level of data available for Scotland at the moment makes it possible to do this kind of projections from a very different angles, short run, long run, looking at the different issues, distributional and the and behavioral responses. All of this is possible. And I also want to say that the work that we've done at NISA by expanding our global macroeconometric model to include Scotland just showed me the progress of the data availability within the past year was dramatic. So the data that is not available, wasn't available a year ago, is available now. So and I expect that this is not going to stop. So I want to praise the efforts of the Statistical Office of the Scottish Government by doing a great job. And so it makes it easier and easier to get the data for the kind of forecasting and projection work that we are doing.
Dr. Armstrong. I think that it's whether to have a fiscal council. I think it's a very tough call. It's not supposed to be a cop-out. But what I'm trying to say is under the current constitutional arrangements, basically you have a balanced budget. And so what is the fiscal council there for? Is to try and provide credibility for discretionary changes in aggregate fiscal judgments. That's the sort of big economic issue that people have given evidence to, have explained how that works. And therefore, that's not really necessary at the moment. And of course, it costs money. And as we all know, everybody has budget constraints at the moment. And so I think I'm a little bit more wary of just creating another body where the remit isn't so clear. Now, having said that, are there important questions? Oh, sorry, you also have an interesting question of how would a fiscal council in Scotland interact with the OBR? Because clearly there's a different forecast. The implication is the forecast of the rest of the UK is the remainder, which may or may not be consistent. And credibility in terms of consistency and transparency is very important for these bodies. As I've said earlier, I don't think you can particularly out-forecast the market's forecasts, but what you can do is provide real credibility of showing exactly how this forecast is made up. And unless there's a very clear and close engagement between both fiscal councils, then it becomes, you could start actually eroding some of the gains that having the OBR has made. And so I think it's important to work out what would the relationship between a Scottish Fiscal Council and the OBR be. So it's not to say it can't be met, but I think that's an important question. There are a lot of important non-forecast sort of issues, such as my colleagues have been talking about, such as inequality and distributional issues, which isn't particularly what fiscal councils were there to do in the first place. That's not really what their rationale was about, but they're very important questions, which I don't think, with the current resources, the OBR could be expected to carry out for Scotland, and they're very important questions, clearly. And so maybe there's a role for having an evolutionary process here, where you start off with a fiscal council, which is a slightly different mandate to normal fiscal councils, and if there's further constitutional change, then that remit gets amended over time, and so it becomes an evolutionary process. But originally, and initially, I don't think it would look like a normal fiscal council, given that you basically have a balanced budget. I don't quite see the return for that, given the cost.
I mean, in terms of the cost, I mean, we've got a list of 17 countries and the costs. If you exclude the Netherlands, which has got quite a huge budget and covers a lot of ground, most of them, for example, France, Ireland, are around about the 700,000 to 800,000 € a year mark. Slovenia's 100,000. But I think one of the reasons why the Scottish Government looked at this was because when it comes to devolved taxes such as landfill tax and land buildings transaction tax, OBR was actually just extrapolating UK figures, which didn't really, certainly the figures we had, bear much resemblance to the figures that we actually had here, and there was a concern that this would impact significantly in terms of the budget that Scotland actually ends up with on a year-to-year basis, and that was a real concern. There was also an issue which David talked about in terms of establishing a fiscal body. He talked about establishing a critical mass of independent economic analysis and expertise in Scotland itself. But I don't want to kind of hog the session, because other colleagues do want to come in. So just one other question, and it was something which has already been brought up by members of the panel, and it's in paragraph 12 of the Scottish Centre for Constitutional Change's submission, which is, and it says here, there is a strong argument that the fiscal body should be tasked with analysing the distributional and environmental impact of budgetary decisions, and I've mentioned, some of you have touched on that. But in the 17 countries that we've got information on, I'm not aware of whether or not they do that. Is that something which is routinely done by some of these countries? I'm just wondering if members of the panel can maybe talk us through that.
So I think a variety of tasks are carried out by fiscal bodies in different countries. Some just focus on the macroeconomic issues. The Treasury now, in its own budget, does a distributional analysis of the effects of the budget. I think it does a gender or equal opportunities analysis of the effects of its own of the budget. I guess, the reason that I highlighted these points, I think, was firstly based on the view that these bodies are quite idiosyncratic. So there is no blueprint into which they all fit, and my feeling, having looked at many budgets, that for example, the environmental impact was a very important topic, but didn't really receive all that much attention. And my concern was that, well, this very important topic would perhaps fare better if it was the subject of external scrutiny rather than happening within government. And you see the classic example of the distributional analysis is the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which is not an independent fiscal body, but is treated by everyone almost as though it is. And its post-budget analysis of who's gained, who's lost, is treated with a great deal of seriousness, much more so than the UK Treasury's own analysis. It's done in much more detail, much more thoroughly. So, I don't think there is a single blueprint, and it seems to me that these are the kinds of issues that the Parliament could pick up on, because there are committees, that are set up to look into each of these particular issues, it seems to me, and therefore it would make, it would kind of spread out the impact of the independent fiscal body beyond the Finance Committee as such, and into other areas of the Parliament.
Dr. Lisenkova?
Well, I don't have anything to add to what David just said.
That's fine, sorry. Professor McGregor? No. Armstrong?
Just to add that I think that the issues that you mentioned, like landfill and stamp duty and so on, that they are very important things to understand all the full implications. But again, that's not really the notion of what fiscal councils were, the original view of what problem these things are trying to solve, which is this credibility issues that governments have of always sort of promising one thing and then offsetting it, and you never know. And actually, people use the term watchdogs, which is a bit unfortunate, because the OBR played a very valuable role. Watchdog has a slightly negative connotation, but actually they can be very powerful in enhancing the credibility of a government's policy, whether people agree with it or not, but they can be by giving an independent validity to it. They're sort of macroeconomic judgments. This issue of examining the consequences and distributional and the tax raising potential of individual taxes is extremely important. But I think that's a slightly different type of body to the classic fiscal council, which is why I had that sort of slightly ambivalent, or not quite ambivalent, but that on the one hand, on the other, answer to, do you need to have a fiscal council? I think there's a very good grounds for having something. I'm just not quite sure what the remit would actually be. And sort of David's suggestions of things like the IFS and the issues that they raise, they really are very, very important. As he mentioned, the distributional consequences are, because its independence gives it this credibility that I think a government would find, frankly, impossible to replicate. And I also agree that it should report to, the report should always be to Parliament. And one final point, if I can just add, because I wanted to mention this earlier on, things like fiscal councils, like independent central banks, are often, they get this head of steam and held to be a panacea. And when economists are unanimous about something, you should really be slightly sceptical. Maybe they've missed something. And we've seen what's happened with independent central banks. The outcome wasn't so terrific. We sort of nearly blew the system up. And likewise, with fiscal commissions, you can see a lot of government activity moving off balance sheet, which is an inevitable consequence. That's what humans do. They find ways around it. And so I think one needs to think about the broader governance structure as well as just the narrow remit of what a council would be.
Yes, just your starting point about observing, having concerns, expressing concerns about the projected tax revenues. I mean, I think it is the case that when we're talking about Scottish-specific taxes, that if you're going to be able to assess the likely impact of those on revenues, you need to have some way of assessing their system-wide economic impact, because tax revenues depend on everything else. They depend on the impact on economic activity. So it does seem to me that if you are going to focus in on Scottish-specific tax policies, that you do need Scottish-specific economic models to explore those issues, and I don't see how you can do it without that.
Yeah, I mean, the issue has been actually that the OBR didn't take into account Scottish government policies. So, for example, landfill tax is a simple one. They were predicting £107 million income 3-4 years from now, whereas the Scottish government were saying because of zero waste policy it would be 40 million. That means that when you're settling the Scottish budget, there could be a significant difference in terms of the allocation of resources to Scotland. So that's why they were looking at more accurate forecasting, taking into account Scottish conditions and policies. Anyway, I don't want to, as I said, hog the session too long because... oh, sorry, Dr. Lisenkova.
Just one very quick comment about the results that OBR produced for which didn't coincide with what the Scottish government was saying. Like any forecast or any projection is a learning process, so it needs allowance of time before the methodology is mature. So I think that this was a new task that OBR had to produce, and it invested a certain amount of time and money into doing this. So not necessarily the next forecast would, well, it's probably the forecast that they're doing, would produce such a vast difference, because there has to be allowance for the development of methodology, and I think that the kind of focusing on the first forecast is probably not the not very wise approach. And also the question about the cost is. So another option you should consider is, can OBR in the future address the issues that you want the independent fiscal body in Scotland to address? Or does it necessarily has to be in Scotland if you want to have if Scotland, of course, stays within the UK, which is, we will find out very soon.
Just one small point. I mean, it seems to me that in terms of understanding whether the Scottish budget is going to undershoot or overshoot, the key actually is the block grant adjustment and how that works in relation to the Scottish rate of income tax. Now, if there is a no vote and a change in the Barnett formula as well, so that somehow or other a different formulation for allocating funding across the different parts of the UK is determined. Actually, there is a strong case for having some capacity already existing in Scotland, so that the implications of different funding arrangements, not necessarily forecasts here, but the implications of different funding methodologies that might replace Barnett could be explored before they were finalised, it seems to me.
Regardless of the referendum result, the issue of the block grant adjustment, of course, in terms of the devolved taxes, was a real issue of concern, as you know, for the Finance Committee. Okay, first person in the committee to ask questions will be Jamie, followed by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. In your paper, you set out that given the difficulty in producing accurate economic forecasts, you're pretty strident about that in your paper, and the Convener picked up on that. You go on and say, and given an OBR which produces forecasts that are accepted as independent forecasts of the UK economy, a low-cost solution for the Scottish Parliament may be simply to adjust the OBR forecasts as required for the Scottish Government's budget process. Now, Robert Choate was pretty clear with us that he said the OBR cannot provide the data it expects the Scottish Government wants, and there's been some discussion about the implications thereof. So I'm just wondering, how serious a suggestion is this? And I suppose it could mean one of two things. Is the suggestion that the OBR adjusts its forecast to suit our circumstances, or is the suggestion that a new body be set up and all it does is just look at the OBR forecasts?
I mean, this just picks up Katerina's point. The issue is how much effort is the OBR going to put into enhancing the quality of the Scottish forecast. That's difficult to predict, but we are developing alternatives anyway. The Economic and Social Research Council is funding alternatives. So, within the year there will be alternative ways of projecting the three taxes and looking at their distributional impact and so on. There will be alternatives without actually any extra expenditure on the part of the Parliament or the Scottish Government. Question is whether these are maintained through into the future.
Sorry, specifically in terms of how serious a suggestion was that? Did you just sort of throw it in at the paper as a possibility, but not really as a serious prospect?
Well, I mean, if one felt that the OBR would devote lots of resources and come up with forecasts on which one couldn't improve, that's not necessarily saying they're right, but on which one couldn't improve, then you might say, well, what's the benefit at the margin from doing additional work? Now, we've kind of suggested that there are benefits from doing additional work, but that that's a judgment that the government and the Parliament have to make.
I mean, I agree with you actually. I mean, I think Robert Choate was pretty clear, and I think to be fair to him, I think he was making the point that essentially it's not what they're established to do. So to be fair to the OBR, it's not that necessarily saying it's not that they don't want to do it. It's just that that's not their job. You've mentioned there, Professor Bell, the work that's ongoing, the different approaches to economic modelling, which is very interesting, and I want to explore that a little. And again, in the context of the paper that has been presented, the submission from the Scottish Centre on Constitutional Change. And I thought it was interesting that some of this area was set out, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I thought you were drawing a contrast between, again, the way the OBR works and their reliance on HMRC data, and I think you were positing it as an alternative, the work that you're doing, and again, you've just gone into that. But Robert Choate was pretty clear. He said it was vital that any Scottish independent fiscal body had access to HMRC data. So I'm just wondering, do you agree with that, or is what you're saying is that the different type of modelling work you're doing makes that less of an issue? that anybody could be less reliant on HMRC data, or even if there is this alternative modelling, will it still be something that's important for this body?
Well, let me be quite nerdy for a little bit.
Not going to talk about computable general equilibrium too much detail.
Yeah. So we do the modelling work that we do looks at different the effects, say, of changes in job seekers' allowance across different kinds of families in Scotland. That's what we call the distributional impact. How would job seekers' allowance changes therein affect people in the bottom 10%, bottom 20%, and so on? We use a data set that is available from the DWP to work on that. Where that starts to fall down is on higher incomes, where the higher incomes are not recorded all that accurately. And there we use HMRC data because the increased inequality, for example, that's happened in the last few years has been concentrated right at the top end of the income distribution. It's like the 99th and 100th percentile. It's the very, very richest people who've who've left the rest of the income distribution behind. Now, the data from our regular survey doesn't capture that effect. But if we go to the HMRC data, which is based on people's tax returns, we can find that effect. So this is exactly the same data as the OBR are using to analyse, say, the effects of the Scottish rate of income tax. But we're supplementing it with this other data set, which has much more information on the benefits people get from the state and so on. So I guess that what I would suggest is that we are able to put together, we have access to the same data that OBR broadly have access to, and that we are able to put it together, and because we have the resources at the moment at least, to put it together in a more comprehensive way, which focuses on not just the three taxes specifically.
Just for purposes of absolute clarity, what you're saying there is that yes, it is important that such a body would have access to HMRC data, but you would suggest that they just look at it and use it in a different way than the OBR does?
Well, they supplement it because there are lots of other places that one can access data, and this is a kind of resource question. I think going back to what Katerina says, it depends how much resource the OBR is willing to put into this, and if it isn't all that much, then they won't have time to explore all these other data sets and use those to enhance whatever forecast or whatever a piece of information they're trying to provide for Scotland.
In the paper, and I thought this was really interesting that this was in here, it says staff should be hired on the basis only of their professional competence. Now, call me naive, but I would have thought that would have gone without saying, but you have said it. Yeah. And I'm just wondering if you have any experience of, or you're aware of any issues that led you to feel you needed to say that?
Maybe I could have put that a little better, but I really think they should be at arm's length from the Scottish Government. That should be pretty clear. I don't know if Angus wants to say anything about the way the OBR was established, whether that...
So there was an interim OBR, which was located within HM Treasury. I think location is vital. It seems bizarre that human relations change so much whether you're down the corridor or in a separate building, but they seem to. It does help if you're in a different building, I believe. I think it's much better if the people in the institution are in place as far as they can be before they get asked or tasked with doing some work which becomes inevitably political. You know, there's no getting away from it. Doing tax distribution consequences does get you in the newspapers. Having those appointments all done beforehand, I think, would be beneficial and would be an improvement in how the OBR was set up. The OBR was set up, of course, in very different circumstances after the emergency election in May 2010 and then the emergency budget in July. It was set up in a couple of months between that, so it was an extremely fast process, so they didn't really have time, but you've got time to take a more considered approach to it. And I think they're thinking about the appointment process, location, all of these sort of fairly obvious but very important issues can be taken more fully into account.
Jean?
Thank you. I'd like to just go back, I think, to a comment of Professor Bell on the impact of the budget and looking at the environment and equality, employment and so on. Nobody so far has mentioned the National Performance Framework, which we've also taken evidence on. And it seems to me that if that is a pretty positive comments about the MPF, and I wonder how you see that fitting in with the kind of work of an independent body such as we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit that the omission of the consideration of that is certainly an omission from the paper. It does seem to me that there is a danger that the National Performance Framework kind of goes off into an area by itself and doesn't receive the attention that perhaps it deserves. So it does, I mean, I don't want to argue necessarily for an all singing, all dancing, do everything type body, but the National Performance Framework is a coherent way of understanding what the Scottish Government is trying to do, and not many governments do have that kind of structure. And that being the case, there is certainly an argument for some way of analysing it. Now, some of the arguments in its in the way that it's made up are not economic, so they clearly wouldn't be relevant here. But the broad economic issues, it seems to me, are ones that should a fiscal body try to call the government to account on, in relation to, say, aspects of the National Performance Framework where performance was less than optimal, or should it inform committees, politicians, and put things out there, rather than getting dragged into the political process itself? Nevertheless, it isn't that difficult to imagine a fiscal body at least making a commentary on where economic performance is in relation to the government's stated objectives, and perhaps just leaving it at that and letting politicians take that debate further.
It seems to me that actually relating it to the National Performance Framework makes it much more interesting from a public and parliamentary point of view. So, because otherwise we're just talking about money. You could argue, I might argue, but so I would hope that it may be in consideration when we're writing the remit for this group of people, that you might agree that there could be differences made in that respect to the remit of the OBR, which seems to be pretty limited.
Absolutely. I mean, so what we're talking about, I guess, in the first instance, is around the very kind of mechanical forecasts associated with the taxes that are currently devolved. I've suggested you might go on, if you were thinking about, preparation for other constitutional arrangements or other frameworks of fiscal distribution other than the Barnett formula, you might want to build in some capacity to analyse and comment on these. And then I had mentioned in the paper, you know, the environmental impact, the distributional impact, and maybe the equalities impact. And all of these actually relate to the national performance framework, different parts of it. So you could use the national performance framework in a sense to link to some aspects of the independent fiscal body's work. But as Angus said, you know, this is, in a sense, it seems to me, more like constructing something that would be able to help the Parliament in the exercise of its duties, rather than what is conventionally thought of as a fiscal body which is there to restrain politicians from making decisions that are potentially fiscally dangerous. I'm not making a judgment between these two, but I think that's essentially the argument.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just on the other thing, I quite like just to hear again about the IFS report and the notion that you might predict or observe a nation's wealth 50 years hence. I mean, I was just thinking that if we were to go back just, 100 years, and who might have predicted 2 wars, the discovery of oil, and if we go back just 50 years, there are other extraordinary things that did happen that we wouldn't have expected any public body or group of observers or professionals to predict. So,
yeah, I mean, so that's a good question. As I said, this is really a projection, and it's based on a number of important assumptions. It goes forward a long way. Partly, well, the one thing that we can forecast a long way ahead is the likely age structure of the population. So that was one of the primary drivers of the Institute of Fiscal Studies forecast. Why was it one of the primary drivers? Because associated with aging, it assumed, are higher costs of healthcare, social care. Those are the two main drivers. It was also associated with long-term forecasts of North Sea oil revenues, which are contestable. And it was also associated with an assumption that the productivity of the Scottish economy will continue to grow at an annual basis of 2.2%. Right through that period. Now, that's contingent on all kinds of assumptions that, technology will improve, that we'll grow our capital stock, and each worker will become significantly more productive. Now, all of those assumptions are necessary to get the projection that the Institute of Fiscal Studies produced. Now, you can argue with each and every one of these, but what they've done is a basis for discussion, and we know at least that what they're talking about in relation to demography is probably going to be fulfilled.
Well, even demography, I mean, I understand that any prediction that have been done on population have never been correct so far. So it's difficult to say that this would be the same. And there are so many other debates around that as to how that might change, as to make it, I think, less acceptable.
just to pick up on that point, I think you are correct about that. And one fundamental assumption that's embodied in these population projections is that migration is somehow a fixed number that doesn't change irrespective of what happens to your economy. And this is clearly demonstrably not correct. Migration does depend on what's happening to the economy, and it may well be sensitive to the particular policies that you pursue. So now, is that a criticism of IFS? Well, only insofar as you might say, well, could higher economic growth, if it were achieved by a set of policies, could that get you out of the bind that they identify? I think the answer is yes, and it would be surprising if it were otherwise. I mean, economic growth can help you to get out of this. There's no rule which says as you grow, you continue to spend the same proportion of GNP on government expenditure. So I think, I mean, David's absolutely right about this. These projections are based on a set of assumptions which may not hold, and if successful policies to radically change things were available and did work, then those projections would not be realised. But
can I just? I mean, in some ways, it's almost inevitable that they wouldn't be right, because what you're trying to say is, based on these current policies, this would be the outcome. But that's not to say that will be the outcome, because I assume if this is not sustainable, you will change. But I don't know how that's going to. I'm not going to second guess you on how it's going to change. So it's a really sort of very narrow question they're answering. The trouble is it becomes very political again. And it's going back to the narrow remit that the OBR has. I think that's one of the reasons why the OBR has such a narrow remit, to protect it, because immediately it gets pulled in all directions. It gets asked questions which will pull it straight into the very political environment and loses its credibility. But a very narrow remit with a very narrow set of questions which are answered in a certain way. They're not particularly informative, but they're not supposed to be. They're just answering the question based on these assumptions. Will you hit this target or not? It's not to say you will keep these assumptions or they won't change. And also, having a narrow remit means that omission doesn't get taken to mean acceptance. Because you can say, well, our mandate isn't to answer those questions specifically, and therefore we're not approving or disapproving. We just don't have the mandate to do that. That's more powerful than if it's an more open mandate. People can say, well, they didn't say this is bad for us, therefore we'll take that as an acceptance. And so I think there's actually quite a useful role for having a narrow mandate on these things.
I just want to add a little bit on this, on the IFS report, and, well, any kind of projection looking 50 years ahead. Well, in fact, tomorrow I'm having a seminar here in Edinburgh, which is looking at specifically the effects of population aging and looking 50 years ahead, and we're coming to, I would say, somewhat different conclusions than the IFS did, but this is not to say that the IFS forecast is wrong and ours is right. What I'm trying to say is that you can take the different perspective and get very different results. So that any forecast so far ahead is the beginning of discussion. This is not the end of the discussion. This is coming back to the beginning of our talk. So how, especially for the longer run forecast, they shouldn't be put on pedestal and taken as a point forecast. This is the number that's going to happen. This is one of the possibilities if A, B, C, D, E, F, G is correct. So any of those assumptions can be wrong, and this starts a discussion rather than finishes it. And I'm sure that the people who are like OBR or IFS, if you start picking each number and just saying that this is what they said and this is what's going to happen, this is not the way they intend their numbers to be used.
And I think just finally to go back to points that were made about the reputation of whoever these people are who are selected to become this advisory body, then would you say that kind of prediction can become quite dangerous and therefore affect the reputation of the body?
It's dangerous. It depends on how it's used. It's not how it's the reputation should be on trying to improve your methodology and making your results as robust as possible, and looking at the wide spectrum of the sensitivity, your results as sensitivity analysis of your results. This is what the reputation should be on, not on whether you hit the target of this one specific number that the media picked on and put on the front page of the newspaper. Thank you.
Thank you. Malcolm, followed by Gavin.
I mean, this has been really interesting discussion for the last little while. I think it really interests me to what extent you can set up a body that isn't politicized in perception or politicized in reality. I mean, obviously, the intention is to set up a body, presumably, which is neutral in perception and as far as possible in reality. And I suppose, I mean, one of the interesting things that you're suggesting is the exploration of alternative fiscal policies, and presumably it is in principle possible to do that in a relatively neutral way. For example, you've done, or one of your groups has done, an analysis of the impact of a Scottish specific rate of corporation tax, so presumably it's possible in principle to do that without taking a view on whether that's a good or a bad thing. But there were two things in your paper which just led me to question how possible it is to be neutral. I mean, one was a remark about the NIGEM, if that's the right way to pronounce it, structural model, and it says it's essentially neo-Keynesian in its approach. And I just wondered to what extent, obviously that's contestable, and I just wondered to what extent that if you know, that approach, you know, led to different kind of conclusions from what an alternative approach might be. And I suppose the other point that was perhaps relevant was where you said they are required for the much needed support for introducing policies which may be unpopular but necessary, which again suggests a kind of role of at least nudging governments towards certain policy positions which they may not otherwise find very palatable. So I just wonder how much in reality it is possible, you know, it is possible to be for such a body to be politically neutral.
Do you want me to say on NIGEM? Yeah, I'll start, and then Angus will add to my answer about the NIGEM, because this is a national institute that develops it, and I was specifically working on developing the Scottish side, Scottish model within the NIGEM framework. When it said that it's a neo-Keynesian, the model is of a neo-Keynesian type, the first thing is it was a methodological comment, just for people who know of different types of model, to tell them which particular class this one belongs to. So for those who are geeky, sufficiently geeky, they would know what kind of assumptions this model takes into account. And just to prove to you that this is not the political perspective of a team of people who are working on it. So I'm at the same time working on the neo-Keynesian model, which is an NIGEM, and I'm working on neo-classical model, which is the OLG model. So I'm completely ambiguous about which one of them is correct. What I'm saying is that you have to take different perspectives, and then it will give you a broader picture of what is the range of the possible outcomes. Because it's always, any model looking into sufficiently ahead has to be built on assumptions. There is no way around it. And can we be completely can we abstract from our personal beliefs in taking those assumptions? No, we're humans. We will not be able to do this, but we can at least attempt to be non-partisan in choosing specific assumptions to get a specific outcome.
My take on this is that NIGEM, so the Institute's global econometric model, has evolved since the 1980s when it was first developed, and I think covers 60 countries and regions around the world. And neo-Keynesian makes it sound a little bit ideological. It's actually really mainstream. You know, it's real skill or advantage is it's big. It's very conventional. It has some interesting options for solving the whole model. And for the UK in particular, which of course is the most important country for us in terms of the forecast, because most of our user base is here, is very detailed, again, in terms of fiscal accounts. So we present a really very detailed forecast, not like a normal macro model, line by line on fiscal accounts. So that's its real advantage. And again, I just come back to the beginning that it's not so much the point forecasts, and that's where we start to get into trouble again, and you want economists to behave like, you know, they're some sort of magicians. They're not. But what they can do is show you all the breakdown, how this feeds through, which other people don't do. And that's really what the OBR does very well. It gets a pretty consensual forecast and gives you all of the details so everybody can understand and poke around with it and see what might be right, what might be wrong, where they disagree or agree or whatever. And models like the National Institute, that's one of its real strengths, that it's very traditional and very complete that way. The Scottish version we're doing, I should just say, that, you know, we've been working on this for a number of months, and that starts off as a far less detailed than you can do for the UK, for obvious reasons, that you don't have the data that you have in the UK. You know, we don't have the fiscal data, it's very clear. But the idea there is we start off with something which we can do simulations with, and then some further work we're doing is to build that into more and more detail as the data becomes available. So, you know, it's just basically not to think that all of a sudden you're going to have this massive model which allows you to do everything, because it won't. And I don't think any model could do at the moment with the current state of the data, although it's clearly improving. Just picking up something the chairman said earlier on, also, this idea of creating a sort of critical mass of macroeconomic capability, I think that's very important, really important, because there's a lot of very Scottish-specific questions to answer in terms of the macroeconomy, the fiscal, distributional, and so on. I do think that that would be a very important thing, and whatever this body looks like would be an important addition to that, and hopefully provide, you know, the weight behind that sort of body. I think that is important to have that in Scotland.
Yes, just to come back to the corporation tax point, this was something that I was involved in with colleagues at the Fraser-Valander Institute, and here I get the opportunity to mention the fact that it's a computable general equilibrium model, but I promise not to dwell on any of the details of that. And that's an example of how it is possible with these models once developed to consider the impact of policies that may not yet be available to the Scottish Government, but could conceivably be under some alternative constitutional arrangement. And I think that's very important. So it's possible, once you've got these models, to at least begin to explore the possible consequences of moving away from the Barnett formula to some other arrangement, of a greater degree of fiscal autonomy. So we've also, for example, looked at the possible impact of a Scottish-specific carbon tax. And so that adds to the range of information that you have to inform decision-making processes. I should maybe mention that the corporation tax example was a very specific one of looking at potentially adjusting corporation tax whilst maintaining the existing devolution system, so a renegotiation of that and a negotiation of pairs around that. So, for example, possible retaliation by the UK government wasn't taken into account in that case. And I should also say that that was an example of a collaborative venture with the Scottish Government, with OSHA, with the Economist in OSHA, who are developing their own CGE modelling capacity and have been discussing with us and developing with us their own model, so that they can explore the possible impact of further constitutional change.
Could I? Yeah, just very quickly, in relation to Malcolm's last point, I mean, it does seem to me that the question about whether this body enters into politically difficult territory comes right back to the question of what is this body for? Is it to inform and to enhance our understanding of the operation of the Scottish economy, or is it to ensure that the Scottish Government doesn't go too far off track. And if it's the latter, then it's going to get into the political fray, no doubt about it. That's impossible. And then part of the question is who will stand behind it. If it chooses to do that. And that, to some extent, must depend on how it's constituted, who are the members of its board. So with what kind of authority is it coming to these kinds of judgments, and who is there to back it?
Well, that was really interesting. I'm interested in the exploration of alternative policies, which seems to be something that you are keen on. But I suppose the question there might be, again, is that at the instruction of whom? That seems to be quite important, because obviously, if the body was proactive in doing those, once again, it could be seen as promoting its own policy agenda. But I suppose, that personally, I think it would be desirable if it was available to opposition parties or the Parliament in general, and that would be a useful service in terms of exploring alternative policies.
I very tentatively suggested that the social partners might be involved in the board, which is unusual in the United Kingdom these days. But that might be a way of ensuring that if the body was commissioned to look at fiscal alternatives, that was done from a perspective that included a wide range of social and economic perspectives.
Gavin?
Most of it might have been covered, but the Scottish Centre on Constitutional Change say, paragraph 18, the possibility of the fiscal body being independent of both Parliament and the Executive should not be dismissed without question. I just wonder if panel members have a view on what are the pros and cons of following that model?
I think that's well, the examples that I know of in other countries have kind of grown up like Topsy to some extent, like the German. I don't know if it's called the Council of Economic Advisers, but it's certainly wise men. Yeah. And they're treated with great respect. Their views on the prospects for the German economy, but not specifically set up with a particular role. And I wonder whether it's possible to just set something up outside Parliament and outside the Scottish Government that would instantly command this level of respect, because clearly, you can have the most wonderful set of models and forecasts and projections, but if you don't have some reputation, then the extent to which these will be paid attention is going to be very limited, and that would certainly be detrimental.
Okay.
Okay.
I think it entirely depends on the remit. So if the remit is in line with a typical fiscal council, then I think it has to be statutory. It probably has to be to the Parliament. But if you have more of an IFS remit that this is not like a normal fiscal council, well, the IFS has shown that you can actually gain that credibility while not reporting to government. But the IFS they don't do macro forecasts; they just do distributional sides. So it really depends on the remit that you create for it, how you do the governance structure. But the governance structure is, as always, the detail really matters in this.
And final, the only other point I wanted to ask was again from the same paper, the governing board should be selected for a period of no less than 4 years, so that it extends beyond the length of a parliament. I just wonder if panel members have views on by how many more years than 4 should because if it's 4, that's broadly the same length as a parliament, although the current parliament is 5 years. I just wonder if panel members have views on how many years the governing board should be selected for.
I think there should be a way of rotating members of the panel, and probably no one should sit for more than 2 full sessions. I guess, again, I overheard the witnesses from the OECD talking about this, and it isn't all that easy to find people with the requisite expertise. So you certainly have to have competent people on this board. You might consider having people from out with Scotland, it seems to me. But you know, two terms would seem to me to be a reasonable safeguard against domination by a particular view.
Okay. Thank you very much. That has concluded the questions from members of the committee. I'm just wondering if any of the panellists have any further points they wish to make to the committee. Okay, well, thank you very much for your evidence. That was very much appreciated and will certainly have a major influence in terms of our report. Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to call a 5-minute recess while we move into private session, that ending our public deliberations for the day.